Well, good afternoon, everyone. Today we get an opportunity to invite into our podcast a man that was very instrumental in my leadership role when I was at the Adams County Sheriff's Office and when I was the sheriff, and really he was my partner in leadership there in aligning the organization in the direction that we really wanted it to go. And we've talked in the last two episodes how important culture is in an organization, and we wanted to end the three-part series bringing in somebody who partnered with me in setting the culture when we took over as the sheriff, and introducing my undersheriff, Harold Lawson. Harold and I had the opportunity to work together for many, many years leading up to us taking over the sheriff's office as the sheriff and the undersheriff. And Harold spent a couple more years in the organization. He started in 1986, and I started in '88. And so Harold had already had a reputation within the sheriff's office when I got there, and I noticed right away when I jumped into the organization just that leadership that Harold always brought to whatever setting we were in. And one of the things you have to do as sheriff, at some point, you're going to have to pick an undersheriff. And Kathy and I actually had known the Lawsons, he and his lovely wife, Deb. We had known them for several years, and there really was no other choice in our opinion than Harold. And I say Deb because it truly is, when you go into this type of leadership, if you don't have the support of your spouse, of those loved ones around you, you're not going to be very successful. And Harold had great support in Deb. I had great support in Kathy, and being able to move into this new venture together was incredible. And I was just extremely fortunate that Harold and Deb said that they would be a part of that, and it really served both of us very, very well. So this is kind of for me, kind of a podcast that Kathy and I have wanted to do for quite some time, to bring Harold into this conversation and really start to talk about the culture that we had when we started as sheriff and undersheriff.
I'm just going to chime in a little bit on that and say that when you're in a political campaign, it's excruciating. It is horribly stressful. And it looked like you all of a sudden had a really clear shot to win. And we were starting to feel really good about things. But I still had a lot of angst. And I can remember asking you, who do you think you're going to ask as your undersheriff? And you brought up Harold's name. And it was just like every measure of stress just left my body. It was like, yes, that is just the perfect choice. Again, he's just such a great, wonderful, strong, steady partner. And I can remember time and again, he would have to call you in the middle of the night, and I'd be sleeping and I'd hear you answer the phone, and then I would just couldn't hear what he said, but I could hear Harold's voice on the other side, and just thought, he's already on it. It's all going to be fine. Everything's good. We're going to be good. So we just appreciate you more than words can ever say, Harold. Both you and Deb mean the world to us. One thing that I would love to have you guys start talking about as we start to paint the picture of what the culture looked like was, how was it inside the agency throughout the political campaign, and then also once the election happened and we knew that you were the ones that were going to start taking the helm of the agency? What did it look like?
Yeah, and I'll jump in here from the political perspective. It was we were going in and replacing a term limited sheriff, and anytime there's a term limited sheriff, there's a lot of people that throw their hat into the proverbial ring, right? It's difficult at times to beat an incumbent, so typically you don't see a lot of people, especially in the same political party, that would be running against the incumbent sheriff. Well, this was the end of the terms for the sheriff that we preceded, and there were four internal candidates that jumped into this mix from the very beginning. And then there was one external candidate. So from the Republican side, there were three candidates, two internal and one external. And the Democrat side, there were two internal. And as you can imagine, that entire environment started some division more than a year before you take office. So we were running in 2014. Our campaign kind of kicked off in 2013 because everybody knew that they were going to have primaries that they had to go through. And having to deal with internal candidates, it really started to divide the organization into different camps. And that was on top of kind of a culture that was really starting to kind of decline within the organization, and there's a lot of reasons around that. Things that were going on in the environment. The sheriff was being sued by all of the cities over municipal inmates. He was at odds with the Board of County Commissioners, so it was a very difficult time in the organization, and the organization itself was under great strain, and it really started to divide folks within the organization. And I just want to kind of tap to Harold to talk a little bit about, because I was in administration, up headquarters, away from a lot of the troops. I was around the administrative side of the organization and had been up there since 2006. But Harold had either been in investigations or in the patrol division in a leadership role for those years, and really kind of had his pulse on what was going on down in Colorado City at the substation and those units that worked out of there.
Thank you for the kind words. I hope I can show that is who and what I was. Yeah, the stresses on the organization at that time were enormous with what you described, Mike. But that was also complicated by an ongoing philosophy that had been in the sheriff's office for quite a while, and that was the separation of the divisions to a point where they had built their own little kingdoms, is the best way I could describe it. Not only was I in the detective division, the patrol division, I did spend a little time up in the detention facility also. And the philosophy and the temperature of what was going on in the divisions was I don't want to say detrimental. You had the chiefs and command staff that, in my opinion, were encouraged to separate themselves from the other divisions. Cooperation between the divisions was non-existent because of the philosophy that had been put in place. You know, and we were all alpha individuals in the positions we were in, and there certainly was an element of competition between everybody in those supervisory roles, which is a good thing, I think. But that competition somehow turned to a rivalry between the division chiefs, and it really was hindering, I believe, the operations accomplish a goal of serving citizens and serving the employees. It was very stressful to try to coordinate between any of the divisions to get anything done.
And what did you both recognize had to start changing internally immediately so that you could start to re-earn the trust of the community. Mike had mentioned there were several municipalities that were suing the sheriff and the sheriff's office over some inmate population issues. Trust was breaking, not just inside the agency, but also throughout the community as well. So what did you recognize internally that needed to be fixed ASAP in order to start earning the trust of the community once more?
Well, I would tell you that kind of the first things that we started talking about was making sure that internally our house was in order. And what that meant to us was ensuring that we started building that trust first within the organization so that we could then build it outside the walls, whether it was in the business community or whether it was in the residential areas, so that the community trusted us and the role that we were supposed to be performing for them as law enforcement agencies. And we knew that we were going to have to collectively bring this group together. And we also knew that the only way that we were going to do that is to make sure that the people that we put into place at that, like what Harold had talked about at that division chief level, that they were in alignment, that was extremely important. And that was going to be the first thing that we started working on, that those divisions were going to be working with each other as opposed to, as Harold to describe, against each other. So he and I started having conversations about what that would look like and who we needed to bring into those roles to ensure that we were going to be able to accomplish that.
And Mike made it very clear: collaboration, cooperation, and the building of teams, which wasn't a new concept. It was just not a concept that was practiced prior to him taking on the role of sheriff. And the style that was chosen was one where it wasn't the saying of my way or the highway, which I had heard from several sheriffs, undersheriffs, captains, all the way down. It was, we are going to collaborate. We are going to talk amongst each other. We are going to build teams. And that is what the administrative leadership is going to do and going to look like. And it was very clear, very simple direction, common sense, and it really couldn't be questioned because everyone was sick of the manner and the way the organization was running.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that when Harold and I started bringing that concept to those folks, that first we started talking to them about possibly fulfilling some of those roles, they were excited about that as well. They had seen what living in silos or building kingdoms, what that had done to an organization, and really they'd also seen how it limits our ability to do some of the things that we wanted to do, because, quite honestly, it takes all of the organization. If you want to be better, if you want to level up, if you want to make a difference within the organization. And every one of those candidates ran on change, right? We've got to make it better. We've got to build an organization that collaborates with one another. And I think that there's typically a lot of talk around that, but actually putting it into application, that's what we were lacking. People understood the importance of it. People that even build good teams within their divisions, but there was no collaboration. It's one of those things. I call it silo building or kingdom building. Each one of those divisions was working in a silo separate from the other. And it really started to push up against our ceiling as far as leadership. We were not going to get better unless we started tearing down those silos.
With that being pointed out, not only internally, but as you had mentioned, externally, dealing with a collaborative issue with the citizens of Adams County, and also the commissioners and those that held the purse strings that were limiting a lot of what the sheriff's office was capable of doing because the relationship just wasn't there. I mean, it had to be across the board that this collaborative philosophy was built. And kudos to you. Fortunately, you understood how that would be the end result of us putting things back together.
I was going to ask Harold what it looked like for the two of you privately building the unity so that you could come together as united front. There's so many organizations that struggle with division or misalignment at the very top, but you two had this cohesive relationship right from the beginning. So and this is really the purpose of this episode is to help our listeners take what they can learn from the expertise that you guys are sharing here and start to apply some of the things. So practically speaking, how did it look like for you guys to privately create that unity so that publicly you presented that very united, very solid front?
Well, and we probably had an advantage that isn't necessarily going to be common amongst leaders building their leadership group. We'd worked together, like Mike said, for a number of years. We'd experienced 5 or 6 sheriffs through our time. So we had seen a variety of ways that leadership led the organization, successfully or unsuccessfully. And through that time, I gotta say that we developed a very similar philosophy, a very similar thought on how it is that you make people better, how it is that you take care of the public and the people that actually work for you, and what it takes to have credibility in the field. We just had a whole lot of institutional knowledge together, which was probably again unusual and might not necessarily be what others can expect. There is one area though where we differ quite a bit. Mike is known as he's a very positive individual, and sees the good in a lot of things. And I guess I consider myself a realist. I've also been called a pessimist, I guess. So we had the yin and yang of optimist, pessimist, and I think that that made for a good combo to come to a decision on many things. A lot of times it was his way, which should be, but I certainly did present a different. I do a number of things.
Yeah, and I would just say I had an opportunity to have somebody come alongside me who, he had a lot of different strengths. In some of them I was strong in as well, but there were also those just like what he said that I was not. And being able to understand that and using that to my advantage, as Harold would use me to his advantage when it came to, to leading 600 people, and chart the course for them, so that we could be successful as an organization. Harold and I met a lot, and I would say that we made it something that was very important to us. If we were in disagreement with one another, that we had that conversation either before the decision was made or, right after that decision. If Harold would come to me and say, "Hey, this is, I know that this isn't probably the direction that you would have wanted to go, but this is what I've instructed, the chiefs to do." Whatever the case was, we always came together and made sure that there was understanding for the decisions that were made. Most of the time, the decisions that were made together. Again, we were in a unique place where Harold was very in tune to the operations of the organization, because that's where he had worked most of his career. And I was pretty in tune with the administrative side of the organization and obviously the political side of being a sheriff. So he ran operationally. That was, to me, there could be nobody better to run the operation of the organization. And I tried to stay out of that as much as I possibly could. We would have conversations about philosophical conversations. We'd have different expectations that we wanted to make sure that those chiefs kind of understood. But Harold was the one that made sure that those things happened. And then I was kind of on the administrative side of things that were going on. And Harold would kind of stay out of those types of things. The only time that those crossed paths were in personnel complaints or issues, because a lot of times they would come from those personnel would be in operations. Those investigations would happen operationally, and then they would come to Harold for to resolve those. And then if there was an appeal or something, then it would come to me.
Such a strong argument for having leadership people who have different strengths. And I think a lot of times it's a tendency of a leader, especially a top leader, to pick someone who's just like me for my number two, so that we always agree and things always move the way that they need to. And you guys were very, very united, but you did have very different, extremely different views sometimes. And that just brought strength and cohesion ultimately. And like you said, the yin and yang, you really just balanced each other out. And it was kind of phenomenal to watch from a distance and go, wow, these two are just really working together well. I loved it.
Well, and I want to also mention in there that because of the choices that were made for our chiefs, it certainly wasn't me sitting there in a chair and making these decisions. We put people in there that we had the utmost faith in to have the public's interest in mind, the organization's interest in mind, and also the sheriff's interest in mind. And again, it came back down to that collaborative issue of being able to sit down with my patrol chief and say, where to go? What do you want to do on this? What do you think about this? Because Mike pointed out many times to me, even though we had an extensive amount of experience, we certainly didn't know everything. And he was the first to admit that also and say, we need to open this up and get a perspective from patrol people in the jail, people in records, all the way up to the top, so we can address these issues that are coming up that we don't have an understanding of necessarily. So certainly it was far reaching outside just us to come to the conclusions that we came to.
As far as creating the culture of the organization, you guys came in, you took office, you were sworn in, and on that very first day, you gathered as many people from the agency as you could fit in a room. That's how Mike describes it. And you started to lay out the mission and the vision. Why was that moment so critical in establishing the culture of the organization from this point forward? From today on, we're going to behave like this.
Yeah, I would say that, Harold and I met with every leadership group. So we met with all of the command, or we met with all the chiefs, and then we separately, apart from everybody else. And then we met with the commanders, and we made sure that the chiefs were there so that the chiefs understood and they heard what we were saying to the commanders. And the commanders understood that the chiefs were right there and heard what we were saying to the commanders. And we met with the sergeants, and we did the same thing. And everybody was there with the sergeants. And one of the things that we did with the sergeants, which I think was very unique, and it really set the tone. And a lot of that stemmed from there were one of the folks that had run against me was a sergeant in the organization, and he was still working there, and that was fine. I didn't have any problems with the fact that he was still working there. But we told the sergeants that they needed to make sure that they could fulfill those expectations. And we put them on, every one of those sergeants, we put them on a 6-month probationary period. So that at the end of the 6 months, if they determined that they could not fulfill the expectations and fulfill the role of sergeant, that we would look for a position within the organization in a deputy position. But if they could not be a supervisor and support us, then they were not going to get to do that job. And I think that set a tone within the organization that here's where we want to go, and we really need folks to support us, especially if you're going to be a supervisor. You've got to support the direction that we collectively have come up with and decided that we wanted the organization to go. And I think that had a ripple effect within the organization, that they've set a plan, they've set expectations, and then the accountability piece, which people a lot of times will say it's really important that there's accountability until they're held accountable. I think that they saw that they were going to be held accountable. And I think that they appreciated that they really are noticing what it is that we're going to be doing and that we are doing, and that we're an important piece of this organization. So it had an opportunity to set that kind of a tone, and gave us the ability to really start moving the culture within the organization.
Absolutely. And also taking into account that, as we kind of mentioned, kingdoms have been built, for lack of a better word, and consistency amongst what was happening in the divisions there was no consistency. There was a lot of confusion. We also, at that point in time, had been changing policy and procedure with the prior administration, but that had not been put in place and was basically held up for an extended amount of time. So you had each chief make decisions and directions based on their thoughts of where things should be and how things should be going. And there just was not a consistent message across the board for the troops. That led to a lot of confusion, frustration, and again, this separation of what should be one large organization moving in the same direction to accomplish the goals. It was imperative that basic, simple concepts get put on the ground right off the bat, that were understood by everybody. And that was the method of how things went.
And I think to Harold's point, one of the other ways that you really change the culture is you make sure that you empower your people, because the two of us didn't change the culture in that organization. Collectively, we all changed the culture in that organization. What we did was provided the environment in which to do that, and empowered those to be able to do that as well. It started with the chiefs and empowering them after we laid out the expectations, empowering them to make sure that they were changing the culture, that they did demonstrate both behind closed doors and out in front of the troops, that they were aligned. And that is, as we have talked about in other episodes, that was new to our organization since I got into leadership. Um, it it was it was something that people had talked about, and it was something that folks said that they wanted. But Harold had said at the very beginning of the podcast how those chiefs, or those captains, as it were, at one point, some of them flat out hated actually hated each other, and
Mhm.
they would do whatever they could do to make sure that they were protecting their division, and could care less about what happened in the other division. And so we knew that was not something that we wanted, as well as the other chiefs knew that was something that needed to change within our organization. And we again selected those that wanted to come alongside us and make that happen. One of the other things that we did was we moved one of the chiefs from patrol division to the detective division. And that was done on purpose, because when he went to the detective division, he had established and was running a patrol division. So he still had some knowledge and some heart about the folks that were in that division. And when he got to the detective division, he knew what patrol needed. He knew what was going to make patrol successful, and he knew what was going to be needed to break down the barriers to bring patrol and detectives together. And he was instrumental in in helping Harold and I make sure that those walls started breaking down. So it was using those types of things to our advantage to be able to start changing that culture. On the when you change culture, you have to work at the top down and at the bottom up, right? So there was also a different culture and a different feeling from the bottom down. The FOP was fairly strong within the Adams County Sheriff's Office. They had a, a good following. And even though I was not the one that they supported in the election, um, I obviously they're going to support a guy that's one of them. And when I say one of them as in they supported the sergeant and not not the chief that was running. But Harold and I went to breakfast with the president and the vice president and said, we want nothing more than to ensure that the employees of this organization are well taken care of. And we collectively need to be working together to make sure that that happens. And I think that we made great strides in building that relationship between the administration and the FOP. And the FOP started pushing that narrative as well. The troops were pushing that narrative. So that kind of just left the commanders in the middle. They either got on board or they were going to be left out. And it allowed us an opportunity to really change that culture much better than I thought that originally than I thought that we were going to be able to change it.
Well, and just to add one thing to that, I think it was human nature also, that clear adaptations and in a clear direction for the troops and the sergeants and everyone to go, was really what they were looking for. Wandering around out in the desert, not knowing which direction you're going, leaves people in a bad position. And I think they were really yearning for someone to say, we're going in this direction. This is how we're going to get here. And again, in simple terms and realistic expectations of how to get it done, and to continue to beat that idea into people across the board. And you didn't have to beat it into them. They were looking for that type of leadership because it was deficient.
And so for the most part, it was pretty well received, pretty well embraced. But it wasn't without resistance. There certainly were some people
Oh yeah.
clearly like what was going on. How did you guys handle that? How did you handle the resistors and the people who still wanted to backstab and to trash the agency amongst themselves?
And of course, that is something that you're going to find in any organization. There's always that small percentage of people that just are not going to go down with what's happening, and it's their position to push back on everything that happens, including if it's good. And there certainly were a number of those in the organization. And Mike and I had talked about this, and we realized that the face of the administration rested on the sergeants, and it was imperative that the sergeants had a firm understanding of the direction we were going, why we were going that way, and that they were on board with us. Because at the 2 or 3 in the morning, those 3 and 5 year cops that are sitting there talking what they talk at 3 o'clock in the morning, they would certainly never know that. But the sergeants do know that. I think it went a long way to have sergeants that were very supportive of us, and that I believe the sergeants at that point, at several points in time, actually addressed their people and tried to put them into a position where they understood that not everything's going to be roses and beautiful weather, but there's going to be some ups and downs, and you have to get through that. And you're making good money, you got a good living, we'll take care of you, but you have to come in line with what's going on. So the sergeants had a critical role in that, and the expectation was that they would push the philosophy, and there was also an expectation that they had the courage to come back to us and tell us that these things aren't working, or that you're off base on this. You don't get it. You haven't been here for a while. So that line of communication was open. Again, it was never this idea of my way or the highway. It's like we'll develop and we'll build as we go to accommodate everyone as best we can. Not always to their point or to where they wanted to be, but an overall view of success
Of the agency as a whole and for the community.
Absolutely, yeah.
That courage piece for those sergeants really to kind of step into those conversations and say, hey, wait a minute, if that's something that you want to do, take that offline. We're not going to do that in briefing. We're not going to do that in a formal setting. You could have the opinions that you want to have, but you're not going to do that in front of the entire group. And that, I mean, Harold and I had that exact conversation when it came to, what's going on in the briefing rooms or in those settings in the middle of the night. We had both been part of shifts that the sergeant would participate in that, in running the organization down, or the lieutenant would participate in that. And that's, we just made that clear that if you want this role, there's things that you can and you can't do in that role. And one of them is you cannot be running down the organization. If a lieutenant wants to speak an opinion, the lieutenant can find another lieutenant or the lieutenant's captain or the sheriff and speak the opinion. But it wasn't going to be done in front of the troops. And I think that had a huge impact. Those sergeants, had they not got on board, and that's the reason why we put them on probation. It's like, it might be hard to do to get behind the organization. And if you can't, or this administration, and if you can't, then we'll find something else for you to do. But yeah, it was, I think it was a huge game changer from the looking at the bottom up perspective, making sure that they were aligned with, and that they had an avenue, that they had a voice, that they could come and talk to their lieutenant or their chief, the undersheriff or the sheriff. I know that Harold had folks, whether they were deputies, sergeants, commanders, that felt comfortable coming to him and voicing what was going on, giving him kind of the pulse on what it is that they were seeing. And I certainly had the same thing. And it was very beneficial, but it's because they trusted that they could come and have those conversations, and it wouldn't be something that that we would retaliate against, or we would hold it against them in something that they were trying to achieve. And it's also not something that we would take into consideration when we, when it went for a special assignment or a promotion. It was they had developed the trust in us that they could come and speak to us, but we certainly didn't get into favoritism with those folks any more so than anybody else that was in the organization. And those things are really important as well for building a culture. It's building that culture of transparency. And I know that word's used a lot, and sometimes they even hate to use it anymore because it's thrown out with everything, but it's important. That concept is very, very important in an organization if you want that organization to grow and if you want to change that culture. And it gives you an opportunity for people to call that out, call it as they see it. Because unless they do, we don't know. We can't change something that we don't know about. We may not even know that it needs to be changed until it's voiced to us. So I think just having an open ear and listening to the organization at all levels as to what was going on. We also had what did we call it? Held an all employee meeting that we would do once a quarter, where we would bring every employee, unless they were, needed on the street or on the jail floor. We'd hold 2 or 3 meetings so that we hit every employee once a quarter to understand what was going on in the organization, and to also put information out so that they were hearing it from us as the leaders of the organization, and making sure that message got communicated directly to them from us, so that they were hearing it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And I think that had I think that was yet another thing that started to build trust within the organization. Not that they brought a lot of stuff to us, because I think that there was still some apprehension, but the longer we had those meetings, the more people were willing to, when we opened it up for people to ask the undersheriff or the sheriff any question that they wanted to, they would come up to the mic and they would speak their piece, and we would answer it or find an answer for them. So it's just little things like that give an ear to all of the employees within the organization that really helped us start to build that culture of trust within the organization. which then leads to being able to start building it externally, because they're able to carry that trust outside of the organization and into the community and the roles that they had inside the community. As the sheriff's office in a county, especially when it comes from from a jail perspective, or when it comes from a court perspective, we were also kind of the academy for the county. We had a lot of interaction with our law enforcement partners within the county, and we built some really strong relationships with those other agencies that we hadn't had strong relationships with for quite some time. And that was just improved law enforcement in Adams County as a whole, and that relationship with the community overall, like it had not been done before.
Harold, as we wrap up, again, we're trying to help people who are aspiring leaders or people who are already in leadership start to improve the culture of their organization. And I know law enforcement is a much different world than it was even just those few years ago when you two were leading the organization. But what would you say to a leader in today's environment, to someone who maybe wants to change the culture? What are the first moves that are most critical? What would you encourage them to do?
Human nature being what it is, as a new leader comes on board, I think they need to anticipate the fact that people gravitate towards building their own empires, um, shifts that build their own little empire, and they don't want anybody else in there, and a separation of the personnel to not accomplish the goals that are intended. My one piece of advice would be, make sure you tear down those walls. Tear it down, rebuild it. It's there. It's happening. Might not be real loud like it was for us, but certainly it's there just because that's the way human nature is. Again, police and sheriffs are a different breed, and personalities are challenging at all levels. So you could guarantee that there's always going to be that issue that needs to be addressed immediately.
And I love your point. That's what happens naturally. So if you do nothing, those silos and those kingdoms are going to build. You have to be very intentional and proactive to make sure that you tear those down and keep them down.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Anything to close us with, Mike?
When it comes to culture, I think we need to be intentional about it, and we talk a lot on this podcast about being intentional, and it's very important that we keep our pulse on that, because as Harold said, it's natural that we start to get into cliques, we start to get into teams, especially when we have teams that are doing well. People want to be a part of that, right? But when you're a team that's doing well, sometimes you don't want to let anybody else in, because this team is doing just fine, thank you very much, right? And we don't need somebody from the outside coming in trying to change what we do. But you also have to think outside of that team. You have to start thinking more global than that, especially as the leaders at the top of organizations. And so, much like what Harold would have to do, is he would have to make those adjustments a little bit with the chiefs. If they started to steer off course, if they started butting heads with another division, Harold would make sure that he kind of stepped in, and sometimes it meant grabbing them both by the collar and bumping heads, or whatever the case, metaphorically. But you do that. And you have to pay attention to that, because if you're not, you're going to lose it. It's going to go back, because that's human nature. So you have to stay on top of that. You never really get to take your hands off the wheel and say, okay, they got this. I don't need to pay attention to that anymore. You've really got to focus on that all the time, and realize the small little cues that are there. And the sooner you get on top of those, the better off you're going to be. The quicker you're going to be able to get that ship back on course. When you talk about, either flying a plane or navigating a ship at sea, you start to go off half a degree, and it's not that big a deal if you just do it, for 15 minutes, or in a ship's perspective, maybe for a couple of hours. But you can make small deviations and get back on course if it's done soon. If it goes on for days or months, you're so far off of course that it's going to take a lot to get that back on course. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't do it. It just means that the sooner you can see those little cues and make that course correction, the better off you're going to be. And it's not always easy, but you have to have the courage to make sure that you're maintaining that. You have to have the leadership to make sure that you're standing and doing those course corrections when they're needed.
And the gist of this conversation, and I've loved it so much, is that you set the expectation. This is the direction we're going. You set that vision, and then you empower your people to work in their strengths without micromanaging them. But then you're also supervising them and making sure everybody stay in the course, never taking your hands off the wheel. This has been a phenomenal conversation. I wish we could do more and more of this. Harold, thank you for joining us. I know that this has been on our hearts and minds for a very long time to have you as a guest. So we're just really honored and thrilled that you decided to join us today. Thank you.
Thank you for the invite. And always great to talk to you all.
Yeah, thanks.